Good afternoon. My name is Alina Polyakova. I'm president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you tuning in on Zoom, following on Twitter, and watching on YouTube to this discussion on the global challenge of populism. The conversation today was inspired by a recent Stanford University white paper titled Global Populisms and Their Challenges, which outlines new democratic vulnerabilities to the threat of populism and how populist forces of both the left and the right threaten democratic cohesion. As we face an unprecedented moment with the COVID-19 crisis, during which many governments have curtailed civil liberties or taken on expansive emergency powers, there's renewed urgency to the ideas presented in this paper. And so I'm delighted to have three of the paper's co-authors and Stanford friends and colleagues, Anna Grzmala-Busa, Didi Kuo, Frank Fukuyama, joining us together with my former Brookings colleague, the one and only Constanze Stelzenmüller. Before we dive in, just a reminder to all of you following, there will be time for questions at the end. So I encourage our audience on Zoom to please write your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. For those of you following along on Twitter at CEPA, that's handle CEPA, or on YouTube, you can tweet your questions in the thread on our Twitter page. And now let me open by quickly introducing our panelists. Anna Grzmala-Busa is Michelle and Kevin Douglas Professor of International Studies and Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Didi Kuo is Senior Research Scholar and Associate Director for Research at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford. And Frank Fukuyama is the Olivier Nomellini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies as well. And last but certainly not least, Constanze Stelzenmüller is Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy at the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. So Anna, let me start with you to just give us a short overview of your paper's main points. So if you want to turn on your screen share and unmute yourself, we should be able to follow you.
Great. Thank you very much. Alina, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to present. This white paper grew out of a much bigger project on global populisms at the Freeman Spogli Institute, sponsored by the Hewlett Foundation. And we've held numerous conferences, publications, who are bringing us several data sets online this summer. And so here, what I'd like to do is just briefly talk about what we mean when we talk about populism and why we should care. So throughout this paper, and in fact, throughout the project, we adopt a working definition of populism from Casmude 2004. And here, basically, we argue that all populist movements and parties make two central claims. The first is an anti-elite claim, that the existing elites, the status quo elites, are a corrupt and self-serving cartel. And second, as a result, we need a better representation of the people, defined as such. And as a result, because these are fairly thin claims, this is a very diverse phenomenon. It's compatible with both left and right ideologies, and is in fact compatible with no ideology at all. And as a result, what we see is that basically it's a global phenomenon. We see, everyone from Orban to Modi to Trump to Putin, and of course Duterte in front in his characteristic pose. And so this is a global phenomenon. It's spread very widely. It's also spread among the most sort of developed democracies that we see in Europe. As you can see from this chart, this is data that shows that basically in the old European Union members, populism has more than tripled starting in the mid-1990s. And in the newer democracies, the newer member countries of the European Union, we see populism start at much higher levels, around 22%, and it has since doubled. So this is clearly a phenomenon that's both spread across the world and in the developed democracies of Europe as well. So why should we care about that? We should care about it for three reasons. Once in power, what populists tend to do is to basically do three things. First, they erode the formal democratic institutions of democracy. These institutions are seen as not trustworthy precisely because they are the creatures of this corrupt elite cartel. Secondly, Populist governments tend to violate informal norms of democracy, of transparency and accountability. They view them as elitist and irrelevant. And finally, populists tend to divide society. In order to represent the people, we first have to define the people. And populists tend to define the people in very narrow ways, excluding all kinds of marginalized groups, and then redefine their loyalists and supporters as the people and the opposition as treasonous. And to put this in a broader context, in the paper, what we do is to identify the cause of this phenomenon, which we understand to be the failure of mainstream political parties to address both policy issues and the grievances of the electorate. We focus on these dire consequences for formal institutions, informal norms, and societal division. And we offer some potential correctives in the ways that parties can adopt new rhetoric, new coalitions, and new institutions in order to basically bring back democratic representation in its sort of older form. So, this is all basically what the paper represents, and I very much look forward to the conversation where we can explore these issues further. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna, for giving us that overview. Let me just follow up on what you laid out to start to get into some of the top line issues you raised. I think there's 2 points that are really fascinating that I'd love to get you to comment on. One, of course, is that even though in popular discourse, we tend to call the right, the extreme right, the populists. But of course, you're talking about populism as more of a political strategy rather than an ideological identification. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And in particular, I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about some specifics. It's big picture view that you're presenting in the paper. But of course, there's a lot of regional differences between how populist forces emerge, what kind of issues they tend to rally around, how they mobilize constituencies. And of course, Europe best, especially Central Eastern Europe. Could you talk a little bit about how these issues that you identify as democratic vulnerabilities are playing out in Central Eastern Europe?
Right. So I think in Central and Eastern Europe, what we see is the adoption of both a populist and a nativist language. And what populists basically do is rail against politics as usual, what they view as the complacency and indifference of previous mainstream political parties. And they offer sort of a new set of solutions, a better reform, a better change, hope for the future, making Central Europe great again. And that tends to be fairly compelling rhetoric. What happens though once they're in power, in places like Poland and in Hungary, this critique of politics as usual gets transformed into basically a series of authoritarian moves where, it's almost a cookbook where we see these governments do the same thing. They attack the courts, they attack the media, they attack civil society. And in the case of Hungary, they rewrite the constitution to basically guarantee themselves power. And all of this is done in the name of the people, right? This is sort of a break with politics as usual, but in fact, it's a semi-authoritarian consolidation of power.
So I think we're going to go back to talking about what's been happening in that part of the world. Poland recently had elections, if you want to call the first round of elections in Poland on May 10th. There are certainly worrisome trends in Hungary. But Didi, let me take it over to you. The US often is kind of seen as an exceptional case, so to say, the idea of American exceptionalism when it comes to bucking a lot of these trends, and even around populism. US is so different from Europe, two-party system, rather a representative parliamentary system. But certainly some have raised concerns about the current climate in the US, especially as it comes to the use of populism as a political tactic, as a political tool. Can you take us to the US and talk us through how what you bring up in the paper in terms of vulnerabilities and consequences applies to the context here?
Sure. So given the two-party structure in the United States, you're right that rather than seeing populist parties emerge, you're more likely to see populist factions emerge within each of the parties. And in 2016, you saw this happen with the rise of Donald Trump in the Republican Party, and to a lesser extent, Bernie Sanders on the left, both of whom critiqued the federal government, DC, the swamp, and the sort of convergence of economic and political elites who work together for their own benefit and not for the benefit of average citizens. One thing that we point out in the paper is that a lot of populist grievances may actually be based in realities about economic conditions or about economic opportunities and prospects for better lives down the road. After Donald Trump won the election in 2016, we've also seen him take on new dimensions of populism. Rather than simply using rhetoric that lambasts the political elite, he's been far more likely to openly vilify the media, for example, and formal democratic institutions and processes, for example, referencing the deep state, or even going so far as to highlight conspiracy theories from the far right about previous democratic leaders. One way that we see this coming to a fore in the COVID-19 crisis is a tendency to sideline expertise, a tendency to politicize the agencies of the executive, to want to consolidate a little bit more executive power and reduce congressional oversight. So some examples here include firing inspectors general. He's done this a few times, but he's fired the inspector general looking into Mike Pompeo's use of funds at the State Department, fired Glenn Fine at the Pentagon, who was overseeing distribution of coronavirus funds, and fired Michael Atkinson, who was a whistleblower looking into whistleblower complaints about Ukraine and activities there by the Trump administration. He's appointed his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to the coronavirus task force to make decisions and be the public face of how some of the funds will be used. And he's also raised, loyalty as a prime condition of receiving federal aid. So some old school sort of politicization of the rule of law rather than adhering to norms of impartiality and neutrality.
Let me just follow up with you on that for a second. I think one of the interesting highlights that emerges from your paper is that populism as a tool of politics is really a global phenomenon. When we have political leaders in the United States, across Europe, South America, again, both on the left and on the right, using this kind of rhetoric, the us versus them, the corrupt elite versus the people rhetoric, I just start to wonder, is this really the new normal, right? Is this really the new politics of the 21st century? And given the graph that Anna showed in terms of the rise of these kinds of populist forces, at least I think that was just across Europe, if I'm not mistaken, is that really the global trend that we just have to deal with and accept as the normal of politics these days?
I think our answer is we hope not. At the very least, I think we can try to distinguish between, if you look at 2019 and the wave of global protests, you have people who were pushing for democracy through protest movements, and also people who wanted to get rid of corruption or autocrats. So the tendency among people is not necessarily towards populism. I think that there are signs that people still want real democratic governance and effective, impartial administration of the law. But what we identify in the paper as a threat is when these kinds of populist leaders turn rhetoric into actual behaviors, when they actually try to erode democratic institutions. It's very hard to strengthen democratic institutions in the face of these kinds of threats.
A lot though I could continue to ask about, but let me take it over to you, Frank. Of course, one of the issues that Anna alluded to, and it comes across clearly in your paper, is also around, you could say, the economic inequalities that are inherent in the rise of populism. And I think with the current crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, those class dimensions of who is most affected and potentially how that overlaps with support for populist forces is really being exposed in a way that hasn't been before. So could you talk a little bit about the class dimensions of the COVID-19 crisis and to the extent that which that overlaps with the trends in populism that Anna and Didi have been talking about? Frank, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, there's a conventional wisdom about why populism arose in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century that really is the story about globalization, that it made everybody richer, but unevenly. Many people were left behind, and therefore, in some way, socioeconomic class, people that don't have more than a high school education are the base of populist parties in the United States, in Britain, in Europe, and in other countries. And as you suggested, that's also being argued with regard to COVID, because with countries opening up and turning from the management of the epidemic to the management of the economy, the people that are really demanding that they be allowed to go back to work are people that actually cannot, like us, sit on Zoom all day in our homes, but have to be out, in restaurants, in factories, in other kinds of workplaces where physical presence is important. And actually, just in the last few weeks, there's been this string of stories, with Peggy Noonan and Bret Stephens and Fareed Zakaria arguing that this is actually a big danger for the Democrats, because the Democratic Party has become the party of all of these closeted professionals that are on Zoom, whereas this working class base are the people that are now being exposed but are also losing their occupations. And so the question is whether that's true. And I think that there's a core of truth to that, but it's a much more complicated situation. Our colleague in the Stanford Political Science Department, Jonathan Rodden, has probably done the most systematic studies of actually what correlates to populist voting cross-nationally. And it's actually not social class. It's really population density. So if you live in a smaller city, in the countryside, in other places than these big urban agglomerations, that's actually what makes you more likely to vote for a populist party. And coincidentally, that also insulates you from COVID, because you're not going to be exposed to people. And in fact, you're now seeing this increase in COVID cases in a number of red states, but those tend to be around meatpacking facilities or around prisons or other places, but not in all of these little small towns. And I think that, in general, I mean, it stands to reason there's lots of other complicating cultural factors. So for example, African Americans in this country vote heavily. They don't vote for right-wing populist parties, but they're overrepresented in the working class. And so I think, it just indicates that there are these other issues at stake. And so I think that we have to modify this economic understanding of what's driving this movement with a more, I think, ultimately culturally informed view that says that it may have been triggered by economic inequality, but certainly the right-wing version is based on a different kind of worldview that evolves in more homogeneous communities that are really not these big urban agglomerations. And therefore, when we get to finally talking about policy solutions, I think if you don't understand that basic sociology, you're not really going to be able to figure out what to do about pushing back against populism.
So Frank, I think you bring up two important points that I think we need to really put a pin in, and that's that there's two, I think, common explanations that have been out there for some time about what explains the rise of populism writ large. And that's that it's the economy, right? Or your economic class. And or that it's the level of immigration. Because we saw, especially in Europe, a lot of these early, at least right-wing populist forces really mobilize around the issue of immigration. But as the paper also points out, and this has been true in academic research, that if we look at the actual levels of immigration, at least per country, that really doesn't correspond to how powerful or popular some of these forces are. I mean, Hungary and Poland are two prime examples of that, as Anna was starting to say. But if I could follow up with a question on the identity piece, I think this becomes such a slippery idea. How do we really understand identity politics and how that overlaps with either where you live, the geography where you live, with your economic community or your economic class identification? Can you talk a little bit more about how we should be thinking about the role of identity in culture when we're thinking about either the populist vote or the rise of populism more generally?
Well, it's it's a long, complicated subject, but it does seem to me that one of the divisions between the left and the right really does have to do with these identity issues, that identity for many people on the left kind of fragmented into, smaller partial identities that are based on gender or ethnicity or race or other factors, sexual orientation, things like that. Whereas for a lot of people on the right, national identity continued to be important. And, so there was a cultural fault line that built around that, because there was a fear, I think, that with globalization and with people moving across borders, for people on the right, that identity was, increasingly going to be threatened. Now, you're absolutely right. There's no correlation whatsoever between levels of immigration and populism. I wrote a paper as part of our project on Canada, comparing Canada, the United States, and Australia. Canada and Australia have much higher levels of foreign-born people than the United States does, and yet, they really haven't seen anything like the kind of populism that you see in the U.S. Whereas, as you said, Poland and Hungary have hardly any, immigrants and foreigners, and yet, they're populist. But I do think that a lot of this are projected, has to do with projected fears about demographic changes that people see taking place in other regions and not wanting that to happen to them. Whereas I think places with high levels of immigration can realize, well, it's not so bad, and we can live with it, and so forth. So I think that, well, maybe I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. I think we could have a whole hour conversation on this. I'm sorry for asking you such a broad question. I'm sure we'll go back to it in the Q&A as well. But let me bring Constanza into this conversation. Constanza, first, I want to give you an opportunity to react to what Anna, Didi, and Frank have put out there, but to also bring in a bit of the German perspective into this. For a very long time, I think Germany stood out as a positive outlier, you could say, in Europe in terms of the emergence of either far right or far left populist forces. But of course, that is no longer the case with the AfD now continuing to receive limited but not insignificant support across the country. Can you just respond your thoughts to the conversation so far, and how are some of these trends we're discussing manifesting themselves in the German context?
Okay. First of all, I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me to join you with this. I've read your report. I think it's really excellent, and everybody on this call should download it and read it. It's really one of the best and most succinct, and I value succinctness, expositions of the issues and of the remedies out there. And I think that is super helpful. Now, as for the German case, I was thinking as I was listening to you that sometimes it's an advantage to be a post-war born German, in the sense that if there's one thing one has had hammered into one, it's the importance of the protection of minority rights, separation of powers, political pluralism, and what happens if you don't. And I think to my sort of German education was added the teaching of my American professors, and the key one of which was Judith Shklar at Harvard. Some of you may have read her Liberalism of Fear. I remember her hammering in the importance of protecting minorities against the tyranny of the majority. And finally, Tony Judd, who was also from a continental, a mixed continental and English Jewish family and knew exactly what he was talking about. So people like me, and I have a legal background, have been watching the rise of populist parties and the AfD in Germany with particular apprehension and alarm. And I think that the AfD is something of a picture book instance of what you describe. It's one of the most surprising things about the AfD, and maybe this is because it's German, is that it has been really quite explicit in what it wants. It's put it out there in writing, in its party program, in its election program in 2017. It's since written policy papers, a military policy paper. And I think if you read this stuff, you would think, all right, that would put paid to anybody's wish to vote for these people. I suspect not many people, except experts who are interested in this, actually do read that stuff. I may be exaggerating the willingness of people to read party papers. But the AfD, as you say, Alina, has got into the Bundestag with an electoral percentage of 12.6% and has since then been plateauing a little bit. But to say that is to underestimate the damage it has already done and the damage that it still can do. The AfD, let me begin with the damage it's already done. The AfD has changed the Overton window, to quote our former colleague, your former colleague, my colleague, Tom Wright, of acceptable political discourse in Germany. Really important point. It has introduced a virulent, xenophobic, ethno-nationalist form of discourse that in Germany previously was taboo, and you can see that bleeding out into mainstream discourse. It's also worked really hard at destabilizing the institutions and processes of representative democracy. One of its favorite instruments in the federal legislature and the Bundestag is the so-called Kleine Anfrage, by which a party faction, including in the opposition, can ask the federal agencies, the ministries, questions about their work, or the political foundations which are publicly funded. And these Kleine Anfragen are famous for being extremely detailed, very often very clearly ill-willed, and just manage to block the huge amounts of bandwidth of these ministries because staffers have to sit there and answer them all day long because they have a legal obligation to do so. They use televised proceedings of legislatures, both in the European Parliament and the state legislatures, the federal legislatures, for grandstanding, and they are very present on social media. That said, they have only one path to power, and that is by getting a major political party to enter into some sort of coalition with them. And they've been chipping away really hard here at the resistance of the German conservatives, the CDU, Angela Merkel's party. And particularly in Eastern Germany, where pro-AfD sentiment runs high, for reasons that I'll address in a second, have been quite successful. What's interesting is the real division between Western and Eastern support. They are at less than 10% in the West, yep, and at much higher, nearly a quarter in the East. And the reason for that is not immigration, there's very little of it, not economics, but structural disadvantagement, something that you will also know from America. That's the key correlator here, and it's very, very powerful. And the feeling that people aren't being listened to. And I will stop here because Alina has been signaling to me to shut up.
No one else sees that except you, Constanze.
I know, but it's perfectly fair.
No, thank you for bringing that in. I just want to make sure that we start getting to all the questions already coming in from the audience. And just as a reminder to those of you who are on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature to ask questions. I already see quite a few coming in. If you're on Twitter or on YouTube, just tweet at us at CEPA and we can try to bring your questions in to the conversation. But I wanted to quickly pick up on one point that you made, Constanze, which of course also picks up on what Anna said at the outset and what the paper outlines so clearly, and that's these intertwined trends that we're seeing, especially in European politics, of fractionalization of the entire party spectrum, meaning this sort of shattering into many, many political forces that then are forced to form these relatively weak coalitions. And that makes the entire, I think, project of democracy more difficult, because it's more difficult to get things done. And on the other hand, what Anna said about how the rise of populism is in a huge way the consequence of the failure of the center, both the center left and the center right, to properly address citizens' grievances. So especially on that last point, do you find that to be true in Germany? Has the center failed in Germany? We've certainly seen the SPD over time lose growing shares of the vote,
Right.
CDU as well. Some of those votes, though not all, are going to the AfD. Would you say that rings true for the German experience?
Well, interestingly, my first answer to you is yes. We have definitely seen a fragmentation of the German party political landscape, particularly compared to the sort of very rigid 2.5 party system that we had throughout the Cold War. And we've seen a new sort of political division really along where the polar opposites are the AfD as an ethno-nationalist, xenophobic, identitarian, direct democratic sort of party, and the Greens, on the other hand, who are the polar opposite. And the traditional establishment parties, the CDU, the center-right, the center-left, and the Liberals, and Die Linke, have all been struggling with this new development. Now, the interesting phenomenon is how the pandemic has changed this. The pre-pandemic, the Greens were trending up so far that there was already speculations about the next chancellor being a Green, which would have been astounding. Whereas the members of the coalition, the CDU and the SPD, were all sort of trending downwards into the doldrums. Now, in the pandemic, the CDU, Angela Merkel's party, has seen its support skyrocket to nearly 40%, which is nirvana as far as the CDU is concerned. Probably some of them think they're on drugs. Whereas the Social Democrats have gotten no traction out of this whatsoever, and the Greens have seen their support tank. The AfD is inching up a little bit, and it has also been notably keen on exploiting the current conspiracy theorist demonstrations taking place across Germany. I'm not going to say those aren't homegrown. Sadly, I think they are. But I have also absolutely no doubt that the AfD and possibly external powers, which shall remain nameless, are doing their damnedest to meddle here.
Thank you, Constanza. So let me start to bring in some questions. Anna, let me pose this question to you because it's specifically about the EU. This question comes from, let me just make sure I get the name right. Chris Ball, and he's asking, to what extent has the expansion of the EU, especially with its so-called democratic deficit, contribute to the rise in populism in Europe? It goes to your point of populism partly also highlighting failures in current political groups. So what's the relationship between the EU project and the rise of these forces, Anna?
I think it's twofold. For the older member countries, the EU has been a convenient way of basically making excuses and justifying domestic inaction. So centrist governing parties would basically say, we'd love to help you out and expand the welfare state, but we can't because of the EU, and moves like that. In the East, on the other hand, there was a different kind of a dynamic where basically all mainstream parties stood shoulder to shoulder in support of the EU project. Joining the European Union was an unalloyed good for the new member countries. They had to join it. And the only critics in both cases wound up being the populist parties, right? So it's the populist parties that basically say, well, listen, maybe the EU isn't all that great if this is what it brings. That's certainly the argument that was used in the UK in the run-up to Brexit. And conversely, in the newer member countries, you have the argument that, actually the EU doesn't just mean an unalloyed good. It also means all kinds of compromises and all kinds of policy concessions that we might not be able to make. So what I think the EU does is basically sort of, remove a lot of the political debate that would have otherwise existed, and the populists take advantage of that. And of course, these days in both Poland and Hungary, these governments are kept in power through EU subsidies.
I think Constanza has she wants
Yeah,
to in there.
I just want to make a point here, because this notion that the EU is sort of an undemocratic power that controls Europe, I think needs to be challenged. If anything, the last decade has seen a disempowerment of the EU Commission by nation-state governments, and Germany has been at the head of that. Angela Merkel in the early 2000s spearheaded a movement which she called the Union Method, but was the opposite of that, to recover ground for intergovernmentalism. In other words, for European rulemaking through diplomatic bargaining, in which, of course, the bigger countries were more powerful than the smaller ones. And I think, in other words, the EU is really not as powerful as people think, and many of the key policy decisions are made by the nation-state capitals as before.
I would totally agree. I think this is very much a question of perception, much more than reality. But unfortunately, neither the EU nor the centrist governments in power have much of an interest in the kind of public relations exercise that this would bring, right? It would be so simple to say, look, the EU has brought an end to roaming charges across Europe, right? That's a, that kind of an argument, about what the EU, the good things that the EU brings and the ways in which it has been democratized, those arguments could be made, but they're simply not.
Just to quickly pick up on that, and then I want to move to another set of questions. There's been one issue with EU messaging, or strategic communications, if you want to call it that, certainly we haven't touched on this topic around young people and the youth, and the fact that we've seen in multiple elections now that first-time voters, who tend to be young voters, seem to be disproportionately voting for more radical forces on the left and on the right. Or I think, the tendency is to think that young people tend to be perhaps more liberal, more leftist, but we actually see that in some countries, first-time voters are voting for the far right as well. And I want to take that thread of thinking over to Didi, perhaps, to touch on a question we have coming in from the audience. It's from an anonymous attendee, but I think the question is interesting. And that's really about how do we think about the difference regarding populism at different levels of governance? So we're talking about the EU, which is a supranational level, but what about national level and subnational level? So at the local level, mayors, state governors, are there differences we're seeing if we start to go down a little deeper in breaking down into regions? And feel free to talk about the US or any other example.
I definitely think that populism probably has different effects in large federal countries than ones probably with more centralized governments. In the US, it's been interesting that a lot of populism at the local or state level really just maps onto traditional partisan polarization at the end of the day. So we've had the emergence of more, I guess, fringe elements. There's like a socialist presence in, for example, Washington State. And then you had Tea Party governors do very well during the Obama presidency. But really, a lot of those political forces have just been sort of sucked into typical mainstream Republican and Democratic politics. The problem today is just our incredibly high levels of partisan polarization, such that even sort of routine politics takes on highly partisan overtones. And in the United States, in other words, there hasn't necessarily been the same Trumpist style adopted at the state or local level in ways that have been particularly bad, that are uniquely worse than what Trump is doing, in other words. And some of those governors have not done well in subsequent elections. And in 2018, in the midterm elections, it was interesting to see a lot of Republicans get voted out of office. Democrats did very well in the midterms, but many of the Republican candidates who were able to retain their seats did so because they were loyal to Trump and showed that they were very willing to fall in line behind a Republican Party that's contours have very much shifted after 2016. So I do think that the state level in the United States is becoming increasingly important. The COVID-19 crisis is showing us that the power that a lot of governors have and the power that a lot of mayors have can really do a lot to shape your individual experience as an American. But there haven't really been good studies of populism per se at those levels of government that go beyond just what we think of as Republican or Democratic politics.
And of course, in Europe, there's this really interesting dynamic that goes to the rural-urban dimension that Frank brought on the onset, where in a lot of major, especially Central Eastern European cities, where we're seeing that mayors are being elected from the opposition of the ruling national party. That's certainly the case in Prague, and in Bratislava and Warsaw, and also in Budapest. And so the dynamics of the local level, I think, becoming increasingly important in places where we tend to think of as kind of homogenous, smaller countries. So Frank, let me take it over to you because there's a question that's come in that I think is quite interesting. And this gets to the conversation we're having around regional diversity. You made the point that this is really not about economic class to a certain extent. It's a much more complex picture. And the question comes from Charles White, who's asking, so would it be correct to say that efforts to redress income and wealth inequality, so social welfare state, I presume, will now significantly reduce populist impulses? And if so, what companion actions could be taken to address the anxieties or grievances of perhaps those who are voting for populist forces? I think Sweden immediately comes to mind to me, where it's a country that has probably the most generous welfare state, yet we've seen the rise of a far-right political force there as well. How do we think about that, Frank?
Well, that's a great question. I think that if economic inequality per se had been the driving force behind populism, that you would have seen not the rise of this kind of right-wing nationalist populism, but left-wing populism, because they're the ones that actually want a bigger welfare state. They want more social benefits. They want more income redistribution. And so that's really the reason that I think that the cultural issues are actually quite important. In the Brexit debate, there's a lot of lecturing by the Remain side about all of the bad economic consequences that would flow from an exit out of the EU. And I think a lot of the Leave voters simply said, yeah, that's fine as long as we can regain control over who comes into the country, because we've completely given up sovereignty in that area. So I think that that means that you need to separate out different motives on the part of populist voters. So for example, there's a core that are really racist and xenophobic. And I think subject to conspiracy theories and so forth, there's probably not a whole lot you can do to convince them to, change their votes, but there probably is a certain, number of populist voters, for example, both in Europe and in the United States, who just don't like the idea that the state has lost control over borders. I was mentioning Australia and Canada. I mean, I think the single reason they don't have populism is they actually do control their borders quite effectively. And I think the reason that you got this big upsurge of populism after 2014 in Europe was that, 1 million Syrians show up and people have no idea how many there are, where they're going, and this sort of thing. And so there are fixable parts of this problem and unfixable ones. And so I think that the response has to be, take into account, these cultural fears. You cannot give in to the racism and xenophobia. That's just unacceptable in a liberal society. But there are other kinds of issues that could be addressed by a little bit more sensitivity to what people are actually, worrying about.
Thank you, Frank. And just to stick with the issue of responses, which of course is something that all of you talk about in the paper as well. I find that there's a desire to see, and this is one of the questions from the audience, and I'm going to mispronounce her name, I'm sorry, and Anna, I'm sorry, I'm terrible at pronouncing Polish names, but this question is from Krystyna Brzezinska, And she says, in your opinion, is there any chance of a successful antidote against populism? Education, strong institutions, a vibrant economy, a combination of these, or maybe some other factors. Again, I think we want, so I guess focusing on the fixable part of the problem, as you said, Frank, what are some fixable remedies, even if we can't probably have, not to use our current crisis as a metaphor here, a vaccine against populism, so to say, but what are some fixable parts, and what are some specific things that can be done? I don't know, Frank, if you want to start, and then let me can take it back to Didi, Anna, and Constanza to chime in.
Well, I think that the fixable parts, have to do with peeling away those voters that actually do have more legitimate concerns. I felt that actually one of the big problems that's more acute in Europe than it is in the United States is this lack of comfort with the whole concept of national identity, where a lot of people on the left simply deny that it's an important category, that we're cosmopolitans, with loyalties to, the world rather than to our own country. And that, I think, simply is not a electoral selling point, with the fixable part of the populist vote. And I think an affirmation that a democratic, community, a civic identity that's tolerant, not based on ethnicity or religion, is something that, would be the basis for winning back some of that type of voter. The other problem is this very complicated cognitive one. People are voting against their own economic self-interest. And you see this in like rural white voters in the South that voted against Obamacare, despite the fact that they're the biggest beneficiaries of that. That tells you that more of these social protections may not necessarily win them back, but at a certain point, the difference between their reality and what they believe is going to get so broad that, I think there's going to be this come to Jesus moment when they say, oh yeah, well, maybe actually, we do need a little bit more of what, the progressive side of the spectrum is offering us. That may happen with COVID. It's complicated, but if you really don't believe that this is a serious epidemic and you get sick, maybe it's going to occur to you that you need to, to rethink things. So that's another issue. The cognitive issue is one I think that needs to be addressed in a certain way.
So Didi, let me give you an opportunity to respond to the discussion we're having. I think this point that Frank made about people voting against their economic self-interest. I mean, this has been part of a long-spanning discussion in the academic world anyways, that we've seen for decades, especially in the UK. And when it comes to the vote for at least the populist right in Europe, it really started, I think, in the 1990s, where you saw these so-called working class constituency start to move away from voting for the labor parties that are supposed to be representing their interests, further towards more kind of nationalist parties, even if I wouldn't necessarily call them populist quite yet at that point. But let me just get you to comment on the discussion we're having now about remedies, and what are some of the potential responses, fixable issues that we should be thinking about?
Thanks. There's a lot to unpack here, and it's all quite complicated. In the paper, we tried to avoid discussing policy remedies. So the earlier discussion about inequality, we didn't take a position on trade policy or, types of remedies of redistribution, that type of thing. But we do think there are ways of reclaiming democracy and the role of the state at a very basic level. So one is, we have three remedies we outline in the paper, which Anna will go into more detail into in a second. One is political rhetoric, that is important for leaders to call out anti-democratic rhetoric on the part of populists. The second is coalitional politics, that if there are factions within the parties that are sort of equally unhappy, say never Trumpers, for example, and Democrats, that you might see new coalitions emerge, as they have in many European elections, to provide a backstop to populists, at least in election time. And finally, institutional reforms can play a big role here. I do think that the COVID-19 crisis is showing many Americans that the sort of war against the state that has been taking place over the past 30 or 40 years on the right in particular is maybe misplaced. When there's a huge emergency, who do you trust? Well, you need to trust the government. When many people are out of work, who's going to help provide loans to small businesses? Who's going to help support the paychecks of average Americans? I think that people are realizing the state does something, and that's something that politicians need to take advantage of in trying to at least restore some legitimacy to the role of government. But beyond that, I think that Americans also need institutional reforms that better shore up democratic institutions, particularly around elections. We have politicized election administration in the United States. It's highly decentralized. If there were more done to help ensure that Americans have access to the ballot, or that their votes can be translated into seats, for example, that their preferences can be adequately represented, which is something that our electoral system does poorly, I think that that could also go far to restore some faith in the very basic building block of democracy, which is democratic elections. And that's something we'll all be thinking about as we move towards November, and how we can have a free, fair, and legitimate election in a time of crisis. But I'll turn to Anna now to talk a little bit more about remedies that we've discussed.
Yeah, please, Anna, go ahead.
So, I think if there's a sort of a quick way of summarizing our remedies, such as they are, it would be to say that if the mainstream political parties were one of the reasons why we see the rise of global populism, they can also be the solution. And I think there are two main things that mainstream political parties can do. The first of this is to respond better. As Frank said, to provide a more unifying message, to reclaim patriotism, to reclaim an emphasis on the rule of law, and above all, listen to voters rather than just assume that these parties know better. That's been a constant complaint in both Europe and the United States, that the elites are not responsive. I think the second thing that mainstream parties can do, and certainly mainstream elites can do, is to coalesce, and to coalesce both around democratic norms and around democratic institutions. I think what the kind of coalition politics that Constanza mentioned earlier are critical here, especially in Europe. A lot of these parties get into power because they enter governing coalitions. And if other parties can form a cordon sanitaire, if they can limit them, if they can basically declare certain kinds of language as unacceptable, that can shift the Overton window back to more democratic norms. So I think it's really sort of, the mainstream political parties whose sort of failures made this moment possible can also be part of the solution.
Thank you, Anna. Constanza, let me go back to you, and I'll just spike in a question from the audience as you think about your answer. And this one comes from CEPA's very own General Ben Hodges, who says he's a big fan of yours, but let me just read the question out loud. And it's pretty deep in the German political discussion. Is the SPD's recent announcement of its resistance to Germany's nuclear sharing role within NATO a core belief or a domestic political step to try to win back voters from the Greens? So I guess the bigger question is, to what extent does foreign policy in general kind of play into the dynamics we're talking about? And should we be thinking about foreign policy as a form of remedy or not?
Okay, obviously this would really require another session because it's so important, but the shorthand answer is yes and yes. It's both. I've known Rolf Mützenich, the party whip of the Social Democrats in the Bundestag, for 20 years. I know that for him, this is a matter of personal conviction. And he is absolutely not to be distracted from this, which I find amazing. But it's also, of course, a ploy, because for the Social Democrats who have seen their electoral their share of the electorate plummet in now 3 grand coalitions, they see their only way out of this and into a renewal through another kind of coalition, which is red-red-green, with Die Linke and the left wing of the Greens, which they're hoping would be in the ascendancy. I think that's a really risky calculation. And I don't think the tactical nuke issue is the way to get them there. But that's, that's just me. I I think, behind that lies a really important question, which is, is it helpful to have a US ally questioning Article 5 for debates like this? But again, I'm just throwing that out there. I would like to make one tiny point, Alina, that we haven't made yet, and which I think is really important. And that is that in this current pandemic crisis, a number of governments have in one way or other instituted emergency regimes. In other words, exceptionally broad executive authority for instituting emergency salvage measures for the economy and for, shall we say, limiting individual freedoms in order to contain the spread of the virus. That is, of course, and as we're seeing in the demonstrations in Germany and in France, among other places, a real hook for the populists. And it's yet another reason for governments to be extremely careful, both with the messaging around these emergency rules, as in terms of how to end them. In other words, there have to be sunset clauses, there has to be clarity about how this happens. And if there's not, the populists can be guaranteed to take advantage of this.
Frank, please.
Can I just make one very specific suggestion for my European friends? So I think the announcement yesterday by France and Germany that they would support a bond program to basically transfer €500 billion to the weaker countries of the EU was a huge breakthrough. But that also presents a big opportunity to say to a country like Hungary or Poland, you don't get a single euro cent of this money unless you roll back some of these measures that you've taken. And it's kind of heaven sent to really fix both the economic and the political problems simultaneously.
And with that, you actually did answer one of our questions that was exactly about this tying of funding with improvements in democratic systems. Constanta, did you want to chime in? We're running close to the end of the hour. So
I just wanted to say that good luck with the Hungarians and the Poles on this. I think that this could also fuel populist resentment. Can I make one point that Didi hasn't made that I think is important, which is the structure of governance on the sub-federal level in America really matters here. And I think that one of the things that we haven't considered is the extent of direct democracy in American states and the degree to which it's undermined the balance of powers there. I think that's really worth examining pro futuro.
So Anna, Didi, let me give you the closing words here. If there's anything else you want to take us out with before we close the conversation. So Anna, let me hand over to you, and Didi, you'll have the final say.
Wonderful. I just wanted to say thank you very much. This has been a really interesting discussion, and I hope we continue it. And also for anyone who's interested, the paper will be available by the end of the month and will be widely disseminated by FSI.
Yes, thank you so much, CEPA, for hosting us today. And Alina, Constance raises a very interesting point about direct democracy and some mechanisms the United States has for policymaking at the state level, but we don't have time to get into that today, but I'd love to take that offline.
Well, needless to my pleasure and CEPA's pleasure. Needless to say, I'd love to do this again. There's so much that we weren't able to really dig into in this discussion, and so much insight from the report, which everyone can find on the Stanford website. It is called Global Populisms and Their Challenges. Unfortunately, since we're out of time, I know there were many questions I did not manage to get to, and I apologize for that. But I just want to thank all of you, Anna, Didi, Frank, and Constanza, for joining us and for this timely discussion. Before we tune out, just a quick highlight of CEPA's next virtual event, which we will launch on May 26th. That will be a report launch of our very own on One Flank, One Threat, One Presence, a strategy for NATO's Eastern Flank coherence, which will feature the report's authors, General Ben Hodges and Janusz Bugajski. So thank you so much again. And with that, goodbye and see you soon, I hope. Goodbye.
Thank you.